welcome back to JellyBeano's audios. This is Chapter 2 of Discriminating Taste by Jenanegans 1207, read by JellyBeano. I'm just gonna get right into this. It's too early for this. That's the first thought Izuku has as he blinks blearily at his phone screen, trying to read the text that's there for at least the third time in hopes that he comprehends even half of the words written there this time. It had taken all of his energy and then some to finish all of his paperwork yesterday, and by the time he finally left the office, he was dead on his feet and completely mentally drained. He'd barely been He'd barely even managed to change before collapsing into bed and internally cursing himself for the fact that he was setting his alarm for a mere 4 hours later. Still, it wasn't the first time that he had to force himself to work on so few hours of sleep, and he was certain that it wouldn't be the last. But usually, when he pulled stunts like these, it was in situations like today, where he had patrol the next day and would be afforded a few hours to slowly wake up and get back into the groove of things. Katsuki would rib him for being useless for the #1 hero, but then he'd buy Izuku his favorite coffee anyways, and if Izuku dared even consider thanking him for it. That was how he had expected today to go as well. There was a comfort in a routine like the one he and Katsuki had built, reliability in it. It was only because he knew that he was on patrol with Katsuki today that he had pushed himself to finish every last piece of paperwork in that precarious stack that had been haunting him for days on end, because he knew he'd be able to fall into the warm familiarity of their usual morning routine, with Katsuki talking quietly at his side or reveling in the companionable silence until Izuku had pulled his energy levels up to normal. And it's because he had been relying on this that he's disappointed to finally manage to read the text on his phone, the one from Michael that's asking him to meet at Michael's office first thing this morning. When Izuku and Katsuki have patrol together, which on average is 2 days a week, unless something else is going on that requires their attention, they always meet in front of the coffee shop that's halfway between their flats. More often than not, Katsuki knows what Izuku had been up to the night before and has one of Izuku's 2 usual orders in his hands, and waiting by the time Izuku dashes up, waving an arm overhead in greeting and apologizing for being a few minutes late as if this wasn't the 10,000th time they'd done this exact thing. The 10,000th time he'd been late, promising that he wouldn't do it again even though they both knew that he would. Usually, Katsuki would know what he had been up to, which meant that he would order a drink depending on how much caffeine he assumed Izuku needed to get the day started. With the disappointment of knowing that Katsuki's care regimen for him is already ruined, Izuku drags his still half-dead self out of bed and goes through the motions of getting ready. The majority of his morning routine is performed completely on autopilot, and it's not the first time he's been thankful for the muscle memory of a completely ingrained routine. By the time he's finished, dressed in his hero outfit, and heading out the door, he would consider himself about half alive, which is better than he was expecting this early in the morning, and with the pressure of meeting with the agency president hanging over his head. Izuku tries to stretch his shoulders as he heads out the front door of his complex, hoping it will help him wake up a little bit further, and he's so focused on that thought that he nearly runs straight into Katsuki, who's standing just outside the doors waiting. "Watch where you're going, Deku," Katsuki barks, but even for this early in the morning, there's no actual bite to it. "I know your ass isn't awake yet, but what if I had been a civilian?" Izuku perks up immediately, a smile catching the edges of his lips to find Katsuki waiting there for him. "Since when do you care about how I treat civilians?" "Since I got my ass chewed out for being mean to that old lady," Katsuki answers gruffly, jaw clenched. Izuku knows that Katsuki doesn't actually care, no matter what Michael said to him, but his answer finally filters through the fog of Izuku's barely awake brain, and a few things start suddenly clicking into place that hadn't pieced together yet. "That's why he's making me come to his office, isn't it?" Izuku asks, his shoulders slumping as he realizes exactly what he's going to be walking into. So he can yell at me, too. He's making us come to his office, Katsuki corrects. But it's not to chew our asses out. It's not? Izuku perks up a little, turning to look at Katsuki. Katsuki, too, was dressed in his hero outfit, but at the present moment his arms are devoid of his usual gauntlets, leaving the strong lines of his forearms visible for Izuku if he were to choose to look. The sun is barely above the horizon, and it catches on the ends of Katsuki's hair, making his hair glow more golden than blonde. Katsuki, as always, looks wide awake and ready to face the day. He was likely in bed, asleep, by the time Izuku even left the office yesterday, and he was no doubt standing here with significantly more than 4 hours of sleep under his belt. The morning always looked good on Katsuki, much better than it ever looked on Izuku. He wore the golden hues of the sunrise well. They complemented his natural tones, and he always looked more at ease in the morning. There was less of a stiff line to his shoulders, a softer set to his jaw. He looked like the world agreed with him more in the morning. Or maybe he agreed with the world more. Either way, it was always when he looked the most comfortable, but also the most at ease. He was softer in the mornings, even if it was only marginally, and Izuku knew it was something that only he was ever privileged to see, and he certainly didn't ever take it for granted. No, Katsuki snaps Izuku out of his thoughts, and Izuku glances back down to his eyes, realizing belatedly that he'd been caught staring at the golden halo of the sun behind his hair. It's much worse. That makes Izuku's heart drop to his feet. Worse? He echoes, a frown replacing the smile that had stayed on his lips since he'd seen Katsuki waiting for him. What could be worse? Take your damn coffee. Katsuki extends a hand into the space between them, and Izuku realizes for the first time that Katsuki's been clutching a disposable cup in each hand this entire time. And let's go find out. Izuku takes his cup with a mumbled thank you, clutching it close to his chest and enjoying the warmth of it against the early morning chill as they take off together, falling in step with each other while they walk. But you already know, Izuku points out after a moment, so why can't you just tell me? Instead of answering his question, Katsuki just glances at him with a sharp smile, and Izuku wonders what, exactly, he has to do with this entire situation, and why, exactly, Katsuki has such a sadistic twist to the corner of his lips. It's true that he'd always been there when Katsuki had yelled at that woman, and it's true that he hadn't done anything to stop Katsuki or interfere with the moment, but there was a good reason for that. They had been on a time crunch chasing a villain that they couldn't afford to let get away, and the woman really was impeding their ability to do their job. Plus, Izuku had dragged Katsuki back afterwards and forced him to apologize too. So really, there wasn't any reason that Michael should be yelling at either of them because they'd managed to apprehend the villain and they'd gone back and made things right without even being told to. It was as good of a situation as it could have been, given the circumstances and Katsuki's usual attitude. But if there's one thing Izuku knows, it's that ignoring a request, or demand, more accurately, from Michael was something that just created more trouble. So he shut his mouth and walked quietly alongside Katsuki, sipping at his coffee and trying not to ponder too hard on what could be waiting for him. The walk to their agency from his flat wasn't even that far. All he had to do was keep his brain quiet for a few more minutes, and he managed to, for the most part, forcing any questions that rose to the tip of his tongue back to his throat so he could swallow them down again. Katsuki glanced at him a few times, clearly aware of Izuku's struggles, and at least a little bemused, but he didn't say anything else. He just kept the same ambiguous look on his face. By the time they had made it to headquarters, Izuku had drunk at least half of his coffee and come up with no less than 10 potential scenarios for what could possibly be waiting for them on the other side of Michael's door. Michael, for all the time that he'd been the head of the Hero Agency, was notoriously a man of few words. He got to the point quickly and directly, and didn't spend time mincing words or explaining things that should be obvious. It had taken Izuku some time to get used to, constantly worried in the beginning that Michael was being curt with him because he was upset. But by now he's grown accustomed to it, and he's just accepted it as part of Michael's personality. Outside of that, though, he was really actually a nice guy, and he nodded at them in acknowledgement as they filed through his door into his office. He was seated comfortably behind his desk, his own cup of coffee steaming on the desktop as he glanced around the room. Izuku followed Katsuki in, surprised to find that there was more than just three of them in the room. Kotaro stood along the far wall, hands clasped behind his back, as he stared steadfastly at his feet, refusing to glance up as Katsuki and Izuku entered. And the glare that Katsuki sent his way gave Izuku a hint as to why Kotaro was acting like his feet were the most interesting thing he'd ever seen in his life. "Good morning," Izuku says to the room as a whole when nobody moves to break the awkward silence that has managed to squeeze into every other available space in the room. All the casual ease that Katsuki had during their walk over is gone, and suddenly, when Izuku glances at him, he sees the familiar, rigid set to Katsuki's shoulders, the way he's clearly clenching his jaw. Katsuki, too, refuses to look directly at anyone in the room, instead staring determinedly at the painting that was hung behind Michael. Michael, to his credit, seemed entirely unfettered by the sheer amount of awkward discomfort that had just invaded his office first thing in the morning. "Good morning, Deku, Dynamite. Thank you for joining me before you head out on patrol." "Of course," Izuku replies politely before jabbing Katsuki in the ribs with his elbow. Katsuki makes a noise of acknowledgement but continues to stare at the painting on the opposite wall, no actual words leaving his lips. With a sigh, Izuku glances back at Michael, unsurprised to find him completely unbothered by Katsuki's refusal to participate in civil conversation. "What's going on?" That, at least, gets a small reaction out of Michael. His eyebrows raise as he turns to look at Katsuki, who has now crossed his arms over his chest and resolved to stare at the wall to his right, the complete opposite direction of the other three people in the room. "Dynamite hasn't told you?" "No," Izuku answers, a thread of unease starting to form in his gut. "He said I'd find out once we got here." There's a long moment of silence where Michael seems to appraise Katsuki, but whatever assessment he comes to after staring at Katsuki's profile, he doesn't say. Instead, he just turns back to Izuku, answering his question in the same direct manner that he's known for. Dynamite will be hosting a weekly cooking show. In the immediate seconds after those words leave Michael's mouth, Izuku is absolutely certain that this is just the most realistic dream he's ever had in his life. He's certain, completely and utterly convinced, that the only option is that he's still lying comfortably and warm in his bed, just on the edge of consciousness as his mind wakes up what can only be described as the most ridiculous situation he's ever heard. But Michael doesn't take those words back, no matter how hard Izuku stares at him, and he considers pinching himself just to verify. "I'm sorry." Izuku turns to look at Katsuki, the question tumbling off his tongue, meant for Katsuki and Katsuki alone. "What?" "This is your damn fault," Katsuki finally speaks, rounding on Izuku. And now Izuku sees why Katsuki wanted him to wait until they got here to tell him anything about what was going on. If Katsuki had said that he was going to be hosting a cooking show on their walk into the office, Izuku would have laughed in his face and completely blown it off. But now that he's standing here, staring back at Izuku with all the accusation in the world in his eyes, and Michael 3 feet away and not disagreeing, Izuku has no choice but to believe the impossible. "If you hadn't been bragging about my cooking yesterday to that asshole," he thrusts a finger in the general direction of Kotaro, who looks like he wishes he could shrivel up and die in this moment, "I wouldn't be forced into doing this." Izuku looks between Kotaro, Katsuki, and Michael, but the gears in his head don't seem to be turning the way they usually do, and no matter how hard he tries, he can't get his brain to latch on to what he's being told. "A cooking show?" he says in disbelief, waving a hand in the air in front of him as if he could possibly dispel the confusion that's swirling around him. How? What? Are you going to say something helpful? Katsuki growls, or just keep repeating the same stupid question. Same question, Izuku answers immediately without any sort of hesitation. Definitely same question. Katsuki rolls his eyes with a scoff, but Michael lets out a genuine huff of a laugh in response. It's probably the first time that Izuku has ever heard Michael laugh, and judging by the way both Katsuki and Kotaro whip their heads around at the sound, it's the first time they've heard it too. It's a nice sound, and it softens his general aloof attitude. But it also serves to add more confusion to the situation for Izuku. I'm so glad he requested that you join in, Michael says after a moment. You two have always had an interesting dynamic. I'm sorry, Izuku starts to say, only for Katsuki to reach out and whack him on the arm. Don't say what again. But I don't understand, Izuku protests immediately, glancing around at each person in the room. I'm gonna need someone to break this down for me. In the end, it's Kotaro who is tasked with explaining the whole idea to Midoriya. He tries his best to avoid it, to put the burden back on Michael, but Michael insists that it was his brilliant idea, so he should be the one to explain it. Kotaro feels less and less brilliant with each passing second. He's felt that way ever since the moment he had to present the idea to Bakugo last night and realized that his death was going to be a lot more untimely than he had first anticipated. Working with heroes had always put him at a slightly increased risk of dying young, even if he worked in what was considered the safe side of the hero industry. But he had officially crossed the line by making a personal enemy of the number 2 hero, and really, there was no coming back from that. Truthfully, with Bakugo as his enemy now, it didn't really matter what Kotaro did. His death was now waiting around every corner from him. But there was still some sense of self-preservation that made him tremble at the idea of digging his grave any faster. But an order from Michael was an order from Michael, and he knew that he couldn't refuse, or else he'd have an enemy of the number 2 hero and the president of the hero agency, and at that point, his grave would already be completely dug. So, he takes a deep breath, and he dives into his explanation, cursing himself for his brilliant idea with each word that comes out of his mouth. The entire time he talks, Midoriya's eyes are as wide as saucers, focused on him as if he's waiting for Kotaro to say that he's just joking and they've all planned this as an elaborate practical joke on him. What Midoriya surely doesn't know is how badly Kotaro wishes that he could say exactly that he could tell all of them that this was a prank and he had come up with some other idea to make the public like Bakugo more, one that wouldn't have the room filled with so much tension. He can't, of course, so instead Kotaro just stares at the mask that Midoriya was hanging around his neck while he explains, afraid to make direct eye contact with either hero. He's fairly certain that Midoriya won't kill him, but Bakugo has felt murderous since the moment they walked into the room, and that feeling seemed to only increase as Kotaro was forced to expand upon his idea and explain some of the finer details that he'd been instructed to spend the entire night hashing out. It was as if Bakugo's rage was another living entity, standing in the room with the rest of them. If it were, it would likely be right over Kotaro's shoulder, perhaps with one dark, tenderly hand creeping closer and closer towards his neck with every word he spoke. We were thinking that each week you would cook something different, he explains, trying with every ounce of determination he has in him to commit every single tiny detail of Midoriya's mask to memory. It would be entirely up to your discretion what you wanted to cook, of course. As long as you let us know a couple days beforehand, we would get you the appropriate ingredients. We're still debating whether or not to stream the cooking live. Our current thinking is that we will record the first few episodes, and if it goes well, we'll progress to streaming, then live in the future to include more engagement with the community. At this point, Michael finally has something to say, and it's the first time someone other than Kotaro has spoken. It gives Kotaro a chance to finally breathe when all the eyes in the room shift off of him. Even the tendrily fingers of Bakugo's anger seem to shift towards Michael for a moment too. This intended to be an instructional cooking show though, so we expect you to provide a recipe and to explain what you're cooking and how to make it. I don't want to just film you standing in a kitchen doing things without anyone knowing what you're doing. I know how to teach people to cook. Bakugo barks with a lot of confidence. That sounds like he's speaking from experience. Michael doesn't ask, and Kotaro values his life too much to even dare acknowledge it. I'm a great teacher. There's a moment where Midoriya glances over at Bakugo, the edge of a smile on his lips, and Bakugo returns the look, rolling his eyes in response. Kotaro won't even pretend to know what just happened, but it's clear that they had some sort of silent conversation between the two of them. Right, he says the momentary lapse of silence because he would like to get this over with as quickly as possible. Well, I also need a written version of every recipe to put in the description of of each video. So when you send me the list of all the ingredients, I would appreciate it if you also sent me a full written recipe. Bakugo huffs and his jaw clenching and unclenching before he gruffly replies, "Fine." Before we continue, Midoriya interjects, "How did I get involved in this? I don't cook." "Oh," Kotaro says, and then he glances at both Michael and Bakugo, because that does not feel like an answer he should be the one to give. Luckily for him, Michael has no problem answering the question. Dynamite's stipulation was that he would only do this if you did it with him. Midoriya turns his questioning gaze up to Bakugo next to him, the words he wanted to ask written plainly across his face. Bakugo doesn't look back at him this time, but his lips turn down in a clear frown. "It's your damn fault that I'm doing this," he repeats his statement from earlier. "So you bet your ass that you're doing this with me." "I didn't tell him to make you do a cooking show," Midoriya protests. "I didn't even know he was working on a project like this." "Still, the stupid idea came from you, so now I'm dragging you into it too," Bakugo replies with absolute finality. Midoriya stares at him for a moment longer before sighing, his shoulders slumping. Kotaro expects him to be upset or put out somehow, but he doesn't seem to be. In fact, there's a fond smile on the edges of his lips, and maybe even a little amusement in his eyes as he finally glances away from Bakugo, shaking his head a little as he regards Kotaro and Michael again, letting the threads of his conversation with Bakugo drop. Kotaro gets the impression that they'll talk about it more later, but Midoriya seems completely at ease with the idea as he returns back to the explanation that Kotaro had been giving before. "Where will he be cooking?" Midoriya asks. Kotaro has always been a big fan of Midoriya. It's very easy to see why he's the number one hero. On top of being very successful in battles and minimizing his collateral damage, most of the time anyways, he's also very personable and very friendly. More often than not, Midoriya can be found asking for signatures from other pro heroes, and he's been caught multiple times getting flustered when people want his autograph. When he meets fans more than once, he tends to remember their names, and he tries very hard to commit things the civilians tell him to memory, so he can bring it up when he runs into them again. He remembered Kotaro's name after meeting him once, and always smiled and greeted him if they crossed paths in the building, or even on the streets, though that was rare. Midoriya was notoriously a kind person to those around him, but at this moment, Kotaro kind of hated him. "Well, we were thinking." He didn't want to answer that question. He had been hoping, desperately and fruitlessly, apparently, that he would be able to skirt around the topic during this conversation and sneak this piece of information into a follow-up email that he would send out so he wouldn't have to directly face anyone when they found out the current plan. That it would be a good idea to host it inside Bakugo's own kitchen. Immediately, before the words even finish coming out of his mouth, Kotaro watches Midoriya's hand fly to Bakugo's arm, gripping his forearm as if he were holding Bakugo back. He also watches Bakugo go very, very still under Midoriya's touch. Would you like to fucking repeat that? Bakugo asks, each word slow, deliberate, a threat. But Midoriya cuts in, coming immediately to Kotaro's rescue. I get it. The whole idea is to let the public know more about him, right? So, letting them see these little bits of his personal life, like the inside of his kitchen, would warm them up to him more than putting him in some cold stainless steel commercial kitchen. Exactly. Kotaro couldn't stop himself from pointing a finger in Midoriya's direction in relief. And I also thought he might just be more comfortable in his own kitchen. See, Kachan? Midoriya turns to look at Bakugo, his hand still firm against Bakugo's forearm. Bakugo turns to glance back at Midoriya in acknowledgement of him. It's going to be better for you if you do it in your own kitchen. Kotaro was being considerate of your comfort. Kotaro swallows as Midoriya praises him and hopes that it doesn't backfire against him, that Bakugo doesn't somehow take it the wrong way. Bakugo considers him for a long moment, his gaze intense. Kotaro finds that he, once again, can't bring himself to meet the hero's eyes directly, and instead focuses on the point of connection between Midoriya and Bakugo and wonders what it would be like to be so fearless around Bakugo, to be so comfortably reaching out to him, standing up to him. For as long as everyone at the agency has known them, it has always been that way. Midoriya had been entirely fearless of Bakugo. In fact, a lot of people in the agency refer to Midoriya as a Bakugo tamer, the one person who can stand in front of him when he's in the most foul of moods and talk him off the ledge without any difficulty at all. He is the only one who can smile at Bakugo and get nothing worse than an eye roll in return. Kotaro can't even imagine what that would be like. Michael had been spot on when he'd said they had an interesting dynamic. Fine. Bakugo finally concedes, but he's clearly unhappy about the entire situation. It can be in my apartment, but it's only because I already have all the best damn cookware there is. But, he glances pointedly at Kotaro and Michael, whatever lighting and shit has to be put up for this isn't staying up in between episodes. I still live there. That's fair, Michael agrees easily. We'll have the crew come set it up in an hour or two before each episode, and then they'll take it down after recording, leaving everything exactly as it was before. That's not an issue. Bakugo frowns, but doesn't protest. Midoriya smiles, removing his hand from Bakugo's arm, clearly the only one in the room pleased with the outcome of this whole situation. Kotaro, really, is just pleased that he's still standing and hasn't gotten blown to bits yet. This is longer than he expected to live through this conversation, so he's mostly just impressed. But the feeling that he's living on borrowed time is starting to creep up on him, so he wants to wrap the conversation up and end it as soon as possible. Great. Great, so the only other piece of information I have to go over, he says after clearing his throat, realizing with a little bit of surprise and a little bit of fear that he's not wilting as much under the weight of everyone's stares, is that we were thinking of doing these episodes on Fridays. That way, if people don't tune in, they can watch the episodes over the weekend. Statistically, less people work over the weekend, so it's easier for them to watch. Now, because we're considering live streaming them later, I think we should just film them all on Friday to make it a habit. Won't that force the time to change? Midoriya asks. That's another thing the public generally loves about him. He's sharp as a tack, picks up on everything, which makes him wildly successful as a strategist, and is also the reason he's so good at remembering the things the public tells him. He always tries to downplay it whenever it's mentioned, but it really is such a fundamental part of him that he can't hide it, and it's on full display right now. A little, yes, Kotaro answers. Either we would change the airtime for the episodes, or we would have you two cooking later in the evening once you've started live streaming, whichever would be easier. I don't anticipate it would have to be much more than an hour difference, though, he explains. Because if you're going to live stream, there will be no editing at all, so we're going to try and edit the initial videos as little as possible. We just want to do a few that are taped and edited so that you guys can get a feel for what it's like and get the flow of things. But we anticipate being able to edit and air them very quickly after they're filmed. Of course, Michael cuts in immediately, and Bakugo rolls his eyes before he gets more than 2 words in. There will be expectations on your behavior and your presentation, especially once you have switched to live streaming. And to Kotaro's surprise, Michael is looking pointedly at both Bakugo and Midoriya. Bakugo, of course, looks entirely unconcerned, but Midoriya looks at least a little sheepish as he nods in acknowledgement of the statement, mumbling some sort of agreement under his breath. Kotaro has never been under the impression that he knows everything about the heroes that he works for, but everything about this encounter has made it abundantly clear that he knows even less than he thought. More than that, it has made it clear that he's about to learn a whole lot of information that he never would have even dreamed he'd have access to, and he can't tell if he's dreading it or excited. Great, Michael says, and he looks as pleased as possible for the situation. Then we will start filming the first episode this Friday. That's in 2 days! Bakugo interrupts. Then you better get your recipe to Gotaro today. Mike replies breezily, smiling through Bakugo's glare. All that's left is to decide on a title for the show, and with that, all eyes fall back on Kotaro. Well, I talked it over with my team, and we were thinking Dishes with Dynamite or Dynamite's Kitchen Time, he answers hesitantly. It admittedly wasn't their best idea, but they hadn't had enough time to really think about it. After presenting the idea to Michael and Bakugo last night, Michael had greenlit the idea and insisted that they start on it immediately, putting Kotaro in the worst time crunch of his life. So they had stayed up all night, scrambling, just trying to put together enough information to get through this meeting. Hell no, Bakugo replies immediately. Those are the shittiest titles ever. They're not that bad, Midoriya defends immediately. Yes, they are, Bakugo retorts. I have taste, Deku. Classy taste, at that. If anything, your taste is discriminating, Midoriya replies immediately, a little snide, but clearly joking. It gets a huff of laughter out of Bakugo, who shakes his head in amusement. Discriminating taste, he mumbles, clearly entertained. Now that's a title. Why don't we call the show that? And to what is the clear surprise of all 3 people in the room, Michael agrees. Discriminating taste, huh? I kinda like it. Let's do that. What? Kotaro asks immediately, rounding on Michael. That title sounds so negative. We can't possibly use that. That title sounds very Kachan, Midoriya points out. It is very fitting of him. A little brash, but not untrue. His taste is discriminating, and he's going to demonstrate that with the recipes he picks, and the things he cooks. Plus, I'm sure there's going to be some less than savory language in there, so it's fitting. Fuck yeah, there's gonna be. Bakugo smiles, and it's all sharp around the edges. Kotaro stares around the room in disbelief, completely out of depth for what feels like the 100th time already. Let's just try it, Michael says with a shrug. If it goes over poorly, we'll let the fans pick a new title. And it's just like that, Kotaro is off on the adventure that's going to change his life. Whether it changes his life for the better or worse is entirely up in the air, but he's certain that it's going to change it absolutely and completely, as he stares back at the faces around him. Okay, discriminating taste it is. By the time the sun sets, Katsuki is dead on his feet, arms aching, shoulders throbbing, and feet dragging. Patrol had been a pain in the ass, and the kind of pain in the ass that was filled with a bunch of annoying, petty, low-level villains that took up the whole day and involved a lot of chasing with not much gain. Sure, he and Izuku were able to catch them, but he and Izuku were also more skilled than those petty bastards deserved, and their skills were much better suited for things far better than that. But it didn't change the fact that it had kicked both of their asses all the time. All the same. Hard work was hard work, no matter how stupid the work was. Thank God the day's finally over, Izuku mumbles, practically falling into Katsuki's shoulder as they take a seat on one of the benches in the park just around the corner from the agency. He's got sleeves of his uniform rolled up, and his green curls are more of a disaster than usual. I'm exhausted. The day isn't over, Katsuki replies, nudging Izuku with his elbow, forcing him to readjust so he's leaning against Katsuki in a more comfortable way. Izuku does move, almost subconsciously, the way he always seems to, melting around Katsuki as if forming to his shape or trying to fuse into him. Your ass is coming back to my place and helping me clean, remember? Izuku groans, turning to press his forehead firmly against Katsuki's exposed shoulder, whining. Katon! I don't want to hear it, Deku. Katsuki leans to the side, and Izuku scrambles not to fall as Katsuki's support is taken out from underneath him. We talked about it. The show isn't for 2 more days. We can clean tomorrow. Izuku bargains as he catches himself on the back of the bench, stopping himself from falling completely and looking up at Katsuki with pleading green eyes. Katsuki would never tell him, but there's something endearing about his curls when they get especially wild like this. It doesn't make sense, and Katsuki could never explain it, but Izuku pulls it off against all odds. The curls fall across his forehead and over his ears in a haphazard way, some still damp from sweat after they had spent the whole afternoon running across town. Katsuki forces himself to look away. We have work tomorrow too, idiot, he answers, watching the last tendrils of the sun set over the horizon. You're not going to be any less tired. But I'll have all day to plan on doing it, so I'll be mentally prepared, Izuku reasons as he reaches up to brush a few stray curls away from his eyes. Katsuki turns a glare in his direction. You had all day today to plan on it, asshole. We talked about it first thing this morning. Somehow, they had managed to go the whole day without Izuku saying anything about how Katsuki had only agreed to do the show if Izuku did it with him. There were a few moments during the lull on patrol, a few moments while they were eating lunch or idly on a street corner, waiting for the next thing to happen, when Katsuki could see that it was weighing on Izuku's mind. He could practically read the words behind Izuku's eyes, but every time Katsuki thought Izuku was going to bring it up, he didn't. And that was fine and well by Katsuki, because he didn't want to talk about it. Any of it. The fact that he wanted Izuku to be there, to share this experience with Izuku, or even the fact that he had to do this stupid cooking show at all. He just didn't even want to think about it. So then, by tomorrow night, I'll have had 2 days to mentally prepare, Izuku counters, thrusting a finger into the air as if he's made some amazing point. Katsuki smacks Izuku's hand out of the air. Get your stupid ass up and let's go. With a sad huff, Izuku does as told. When Friday comes and Kotaro arrives with the lighting and film crews to Bakugo's apartment, he doesn't know what he expects to find. What he does know is that he wasn't prepared for Midoriya to be the one answering the door, a broad smile on his face as he waved everyone into the apartment. He also knows that he didn't expect the apartment to have so much personality. Bakugo is notoriously aloof and closed off, with very little about his personal life actually known to the people at the agency, let alone the public, so it's an incredibly large shock for Kotaro to walk in and find framed pictures, decorative pillows, posters on the wall, why don't we call that the show, etc. Bakugo's apartment actually looks like a home, and more than that, it looks lived in. It doesn't look cold, it doesn't look empty. It doesn't look like some empty apartment that could have been an image pulled straight out of a magazine. There's a blanket haphazardly folded up at the end of the couch. There's shoes by the door and a coat hanging on a hook above them. It looks like the opposite of everything Kotaro would have expected, and the fact that it immediately feels welcoming almost makes him feel alarmed. Midoriya greets everyone individually, committing their names to memory the way he always does. Before guiding them all to the kitchen, he's dressed down in jeans and a nice button-up shirt, and it might be the first time Kotaro has ever seen him in something that isn't green or white. His curls are the most tame that Kotaro has ever seen as well. He moves around Bakugo's apartment with absolute ease, stepping around furniture that he can't even see because he's glancing over his shoulder to talk to the crew that he's leading. It's clear that he's been here before, but Kotaro adds it to the list of things that he'll never mention for fear of death. They collectively make it to the kitchen where Bakugo already is, standing at the counter with a drawer open as he sorts through utensils, glancing up briefly as everyone enters the room. "Damn it," he grumbles. "Where the fuck is my good knife?" "Kachan," Midoriya says immediately, exasperated. "I told you earlier that I was washing it." Bakugo straightens up immediately, glancing over at the sink where a variety of things are drying in a dish drainer. His eyes seem to snag on something immediately, and he looks triumphant as he reaches for it, grabbing a towel and carefully drying the sharp blade as he turns back to the group of people now standing in his kitchen and looking at him. "Good evening, Bakugo," Kotaro greets, stepping in front of the crowd. "Thank you for allowing us into your home." "Didn't have a choice," Bakugo points out, only to get a sharp elbow in the ribs from Midoriya. "That's true," Kotaro concedes, inclining his head. "But even still, we appreciate it. You could have locked the door." "Not with Deku here, I couldn't have," Bakugo replies, and Midoriya shoots the group of people a winning smile. "He would have tied me to a chair before he would have let me do something like that." "It would be very rude," Midoriya cries, and a ripple of laughter goes through the room. The gentle bickering seems to break the tension a little bit, and Kotaro hadn't realized exactly how much had been there until it was gone. He thinks again to Michael's comment about the dynamic between Midoriya and Bakugo, and he feels something settle in his stomach. He can't name what it is, but it gives him the same sort of comfortable unease that Bakugo's apartment gives him. Something about him feels like he should be on edge around the two of them, that he should be worried and afraid, the way he's always been. But with them standing in front of him, in jeans, bickering over something so normal and making jokes like any of Kotaro's friends would make, they just feel like normal people. Like approachable people. For one fleeting, momentary second, Kotaro thinks that making Bakugo likable to the public isn't impossible. That maybe, just maybe, there really is humanity in there. And he's just been keeping it locked away for one reason or another. Did you get the ingredients?" Bakugo asks, and the sudden sound of his voice shakes Kotaro out of his sudden reverie. He shakes himself back to the present moment and jumps back to life, hustling up to the countertop to deposit the bag he had been holding in his hand the entire time. "Yes, right here. I've got you everything on your list." Bakugo immediately starts to open the bag and pull out the ingredients inside, with Midoriya close at his shoulder, leaning over to watch. "Katsuran?" Midoriya asks, as Bakugo lays down a package of pork. "That's what you picked for your first dish?" "You complaining, Deku?" Bakugo glances up at him, continuing to empty the bag as he does so. "You just have to sit there and eat." "No, no, no!" Midoriya replies immediately, meeting Bakugo's gaze. "You just usually hate when I request Katsuran." "Yeah, because you don't ever do shit and I still have the nerve to put in a request." Bakugo replies, and it earns a smile from Midoriya, who reaches over his shoulder for rice, gathering it up in his hands. "But it's an easy recipe to teach, so I figured it would be a good starting point." "I think that was very smart of you, Kachan," Midoriya says approvingly. The warm smile that he usually wears is just a little bit different than usual. Kotaro can't quite put his finger on it, but there's something a little more fond around the edges. It takes a second for Kotaro to realize he's done nothing but stand there and watch their exchange while the rest of the crew has started setting up different lighting equipment and testing out microphones. Luckily, neither Midoriya nor Bakugo seem to have noticed that he's just hovering at the end of the counter either, and he's able to quietly take a few steps back and meld into the work the other members of this team are doing. The setup goes surprisingly quickly, not that Kotaro had really any idea how long it would take. He certainly doesn't know anything about lighting or how involved it is, but they had managed to hire a very skilled team who made it look like the easiest thing in the world, and suddenly Bakugo's kitchen was flooded with light, and Midori and Bakugo were both being fitted with microphones. Suddenly, this thing that Kotaro had come up with was coming to life, and he was realizing that there was no more backing out now. He thinks again of his office, and the cardboard boxes he had considered packing all of his items into, of the black mark this would leave on his career if it went wrong. But then he thinks of the fleeting moment of humanity he felt from both Bakugo and Midoriya, of the way they had felt just like regular people instead of larger-than-life celebrities, and he has a moment of courage. If this goes down in flames, which is still very much possible, as much as he wishes it wasn't, he's going to go down in flames with it. The kitchen is set up, the ingredients are spread out on the counter, Bakugo and Midoriya are in their places, behind the counter, and the rest of the crew is out of the frame. The sound crew is giving Kotaro the thumbs up that everything's working. The film crew seems content with the picture they have, and suddenly, Kotaro is counting down to the first episode of something that he knows he'll never be fully prepared for. Ready? Kotaro asks. Midoriya nods, and Bakugo gives half an inclination of the head in acknowledgement. Recording in 3, 2, 1. Discriminating Taste. Cooking with Dynamite. Episode 1. Spicy Katsudon. Follow along with Dynamite's recipe here. The screen is black for a long second, almost too long of a second, as if there might be some sort of technical difficulty. But then, all at once, the picture comes into view. Dynamite is standing in the middle of the screen, right in the center of a beautiful marble kitchen island, with a series of ingredients spread out before him. He has on a deep red button-up and he's scowling at the screen. Next to him, a stark contrast in both color and attitude, is Deku, smiling and waving at the screen in his light blue button-up. "Good evening, everyone," Deku says warmly as he continues to wave at the screen, his eyes crinkled in the corners. "Thank you for joining us in Katran's kitchen." Dynamite's scowl deepens as he lets out a deep sigh. "Yeah," he says after a moment. "Thanks for joining us, or something." "You know," Deku says, entirely unbothered by Dynamite's attitude, "Katran's kitchen would have been a good name for this show, too." "Shut up and sit down," Dynamite says without any hesitation, his hand finding Deku's shoulder and giving him a shove. It would seem mean if Deku didn't laugh in response, clearly delighted at the reaction he had gotten. He stumbles a step away before immediately coming back to Dynamite's side, a magnet drawn back to its opposite pole. "Wait," he says cheerfully, crouching down. It appears that he's reaching into a cupboard underneath the island, but it's impossible to tell from the camera angle. Dynamite watches him, still frowning, and ends up stepping out of the way when Deku appears to throw open another cupboard door, knocking him in the shin. "Ow! Watch what you're doing, Deku," Dynamite barks, bending to rub just below his knee. "Sorry," Deku replies, immediately reaching to place his own hand over Dynamite's. Dynamite brushes his hands away and Deku smiles sheepishly as he returns back to what he had been doing, his head nearly disappearing completely as he reaches almost his entire body into the cupboard. "The hell are you even doing? I already got everything out," Dynamite remarks, and as he straightens back up and takes another step back for good measure. "I swear, it's in here somewhere." Deku is clearly wearing a microphone so his words can still be heard, even though he can't really be seen, but the effort he's putting into whatever he's doing is clear in the tension of his voice. And then, just as suddenly as he disappeared, he exclaims, "Aha!" And then he's standing back up, closing the cupboard and clutching the box against his chest. Dynamite glances between Deku, the box in his arms, and the cupboard it had just come out of. "What the hell is that? When did you even get that in here?" "It's a gift!" Deku smiles, extending the box towards Dynamite with a big smile and completely ignoring the second half of the question that was asked. "To commemorate the show that you're doing." Dynamite stares at the box in Deku's hands as if it has offended him somehow, or as if it might be somehow plotting against him. There's something definitely mischievous in Deku's expression, somewhere in the curl of his smile or in the laughter in his eyes, and the look on Dynamite's face suggests that he's seen that and even more. Hesitantly, he reaches out to take the box, shaking it while it's extended away from his body. There's a very faint rustling noise that comes from it, but nothing else. "What is it?" he asks, looking suspiciously at Deku. Deku just smiles in a way that is so innocent it looks guilty. "You have to open it to find out, that's the whole point." With one more uncertain look at Deku, Dynamite sets the box down on the counter directly in front of him. He spends a moment rearranging the ingredients on the counter so he can more easily open the box, and then he's doing exactly that. Tearing off a piece of tape that's holding the lid of the box shut and carefully pulling it off. There's tissue paper inside the box that he carefully opens, and then his expression morphs completely. "Deku," he says, turning to look lethally at Deku next to him. "What the fuck is this?" Deku, for his part, looks far too pleased as he answers. "It's an apron! You've been complaining that you needed a new one for a while, so I figured that it would be perfect to kick off your new cooking show." Dynamite reaches into the box and pulls the green apron out, holding it up in front of him as he turns to face Deku. "Why does it say #1 Deku Superfan on it?" There's a long moment where Deku tries and fails miserably at hiding his grin. He bites the corners of his lip as he glances away from Dynamite, his hand a fist as he presses it against the countertop in what appears to be a desperate bid to keep his composure. His shoulders shake with the laughter that he's trying to suppress, but even through the screen, it's easy to see that he's barely holding on to his professional presentation. "Well," he says, and then he has to pause because the sound of his laughter starts slipping through again. "You are my biggest fan, aren't you, Kachan?" There's a moment of commotion before the screen flashes. When the picture comes back, Dynamite is once again standing behind the counter, wearing the green #1 Deku Superfan apron. And Deku is seated on a stool just off to the side with the biggest grin that has probably ever existed. He looks more pleased than anything else as he watches Dynamite adjust the apron and continue to send him death glares. "Deku," a voice says from off-screen, and both Dynamite and Deku turn to look at someone that can't be seen on camera. "What makes you say he's your biggest fan? You have a lot of fans who, I bet, aren't willing to give up that title so easily." Deku laughs warmly as he settles into his chair, propping an elbow on the counter and settling his chin into his palm. "You're right, I am blessed with some very amazing fans. But Kachan and I have known each other since we were kids, so as much as I appreciate every single fan for their love and support, Kachan has about 15 years on all of them." "I did not love or support you for those 15 years, Dynamite remarks. "And I don't love or support you now either, you bastard." "Your apron suggests otherwise," Deku remarks. "That's only because you're enough of a smug bastard to come into my house and throw away my old apron, so I'm forced to wear this ugly thing." Dynamite gestures to the apron as he talks, as if there was any uncertainty as to what he was referring to. "Like I said, you've been complaining for a while that your other apron was getting old. I was just doing you a favor." Deku offers the same smile that's so innocent it's actually guilty, and Dynamite rolls his eyes in response. "I will get revenge for this," he remarks. "But can we just get on with the damn cooking so I can take this stupid thing off? That's what everyone's supposedly here for anyway, right?" Dynamite is looking off screen again, presumably at whoever had spoken before. Deku follows his gaze, and there seems to be some sort of wordless communication happening, even though the third person in the conversation is completely out of view. It appears that he gives the approval, though, because Dynamite sends Deku a smug look and begins reaching for the ingredients. "Great," he says. "We're making katsudon today. I sent him," he gestures to the same mystery off-screen person again, "my recipe, and I'm told it'll be linked somewhere in this video so you can follow along. Kachan makes really good katsudon." Deku cuts in, smiling as he turns his head and his palm to watch as Dynamite begins reaching for the ingredients. "Damn right I do." He grabs a knife off the counter and slices through the pork packaging with ease. "And as usual, you're just sitting there doing nothing." "I offer moral support," Deku says. "Plus, I washed the rice for you." Wow, Dynamite replies sarcastically as he pulls pork out of the package and places each slice on a piece of plastic wrap. What would I do without you? Probably be the number one hero. Deku quips, and Dynamite's head whips up so fast that it looks painful. Okay, okay. The mystery person rushes on screen suddenly, waving hands in front of him as he does so. Please don't kill each other. But despite Dynamite's instant reaction that the apparent harshness of Deku's words, neither of them look like they're going to kill each other. In fact, Dynamite's eyebrows have risen so high up they've practically disappeared off his face as he stares at Deku. His mouth partially open in what can only be described as disbelief. But he looks a little impressed, too. Like he didn't expect Deku to say something so bold. Deku smiles at him, but all the smugness is gone, and it wavers around the edges with guilt and what looks like an invisible apology. The mystery man stands with his back to the camera on the opposite side of the counter as the two heroes staring nervously between the two of them. Finally, Dynamite goes back to what he was doing, placing the knife down as he folds the piece of plastic wrap in half so that the pork is completely covered by it, picking up a neat meat tenderizer instead. You've always been the biggest shit I've known. Deku turns his attention to the mystery man after it's become clear that Dynamite isn't actually going to kill him, offering an apologetic smile. Sorry, Kotaro. I promise there will only be cooking and no murdering. Speak for yourself, Dynamite mumbles. I promise on both of our behalves, Deku repeats with emphasis. Only cooking, no murdering. The mystery man, Kotaro, sags against the counter, pressing both hands against the countertop and dragging his head between his shoulders. I agree with Dynamite. Can we get to the cooking part? Yeah. Dynamite points at the meat tenderizer at Deku. Kotaro says sit the hell down and shut the hell up, Deku. Well, now, I didn't say that. Kotaro hedges, scrubbing a hand across his eyes as he stands up. But this is supposed to be a cooking show. I'm sorry, Deku says again. I promise I'll stop. And then he turns his smile towards Dynamite. Go on, Kacchan, I won't interrupt. Kotaro makes his way back off screen, and the actual cooking portion of the show finally proceeds. Dynamite is surprisingly a good teacher. He takes his time to not only explain what he's doing, but to demonstrate it as well. On top of that, he gives different options and explains how it will affect not only the cooking time, but the final taste of the dish. His preferred method of making katsudon involves flattening the meat with the tenderizer first before coating each side in salt and pepper and a light dusting of salt. Once Katsuki has the meat prepared, he heats up a small amount of oil in a pan and begins explaining how to know when the oil is done and what to prepare in the meantime. I'm not going to tell you how to cook rice, he says once he's finished setting up the bowls with egg and panko for the meat. Because if you can't do that, you shouldn't be cooking at all. The first time you cooked us rice, you burned it so bad that your mom had to throw away the pan completely. Deku finally speaks up again. We were 9, Deku. Dynamite grumbles, shooting him another glare that Deku completely ignores. Deku keeps talking as Dynamite dips the meat in the egg and then the panko before gently setting it into the pan. He had already explained the next step, so Deku isn't interrupting any important information. So, what if there are 9-year-olds watching this? Dynamite puts the last piece of meat in the pan and turns to point his chopsticks at the camera. If you're letting your 9-year-olds watch this, you're a shitty parent. There's nothing about me that's appropriate for a 9-year-old. That earns a laugh from Deku as he sits up right fully. That's a good point. This show probably isn't appropriate for children. Hell no, it's not, Dynamite replies as he begins picking up dishes off the counter and setting them in the sink. Deku, though, still seems to be stuck on the memory he'd brought up. Do you remember your mom's face when you did that? When she came home to the house filled with smoke? She was so pissed. Dynamite laughs, a genuine smile on his lips, as he leans back against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. She yelled at us for at least 10 minutes after that. Your dad was so proud, though. Deku reminisces, his gaze far away, as if he were reliving the moment again. He's always been so easy to please.
Dynamite says with a shrug, but his smile almost looks tender. If I tried anything, he was proud, even if I failed. Same went for you, too. He was always proud of everything you did.
Deku's smile was outright fond as he turns to look at Dynamite. I remember the first time I fell and scraped up my knee. When he was patching me up, he told me that my scrape was proof that I had done something new. Dynamite looks to the side, glancing at his food instead of meeting Deku's gaze.
He was always soft like that.
I think it's nice, Deku says. I think we needed that when we were younger.
You did.
Dynamite presses off the counter and turns towards the stove, reaching for the handle of the pork pan and shifting it slightly over the heat.
You were so goddamn clumsy back then. You were constantly getting hurt. Somebody needed to baby you.
Dynamite flips the pork in the pan and reaches for the pan with rice, peeking through the lid to make sure it was cooking appropriately. Pleased, he turns back towards the camera, leaning against the counter again. The pork cooks for 5 to 6 minutes per side, he said initially, so they had 5 to 6 minutes to kill before anything needed to be done. He'd already cut up the onions for the next step. The egg was already beaten in a bowl. Silence fills for a moment through the kitchen, but it doesn't seem to be awkward. It was clear in the conversation that they had just shared that Dynamite and Deku are close, but it's also clear in the companionable way that they are able to sit in silence together. Still, probably because it makes bad TV to have complete silence, Kotaro's voice pipes up from off screen suddenly. I don't think I knew that you guys were friends growing up. Oh yeah, Deku says immediately. We've been friends our whole lives.
I tried my hardest to get rid of him, Dynamite says, and the wry twist to Deku's lips implies that it's a true statement. Didn't work, obviously.
You tried to get rid of him, Kotaro repeats. But you were the one who said you wouldn't do this cooking show unless he did it with you. Immediately there's a dusting of red across Dynamite's cheeks, traveling up towards the tips of his ears. He clenches his jaw and looks stubbornly away from the camera, away from Deku, and away from where Kotaro is presumably standing, even though he can't be seen for it to be confirmed. But he doesn't say anything. See, Kachan? Deku says after a moment. You are my #1 fan.
I'm going to go back to Michael and tell him that I'll only do the show if you aren't involved.
Dynamite grinds out, his cheeks bright red at his point. It'll be too late at that point, Deku points out. This episode will have already aired and everyone will already know how much you love me. I like him being here, Kotaro says, and there's a little bit of hesitancy in his voice. I think he can give us a lot of secrets about you. Dynamite raises an eyebrow, and he looks both surprised and impressed.
That's a bold thing to say.
Deku promised me no murder, Kotaro reminds him. Deku laughs and Dynamite glances at him, even through the cameras. It looks like the red in his cheeks darken a little.
I can tell secrets about Deku too, you know. Dynamite says after a moment.
Oh? Kotaro says, and Deku is staring at Dynamite as if he's either daring him to try or not sure that he would actually do it. Do you know that he has his own cooking playlist? It's full of ridiculous songs that he sings and dances to whenever he cooks. Dynamite stares directly at Deku as he says it, clearly accepting an unspoken challenge. It's a good playlist, Deku cries immediately. And cooking is more fun with music. What are the odds we can hear this playlist? Kotaro asks. Deku hesitates for a moment, glancing at Dynamite.
Trust me, Dynamite says. You don't want to see his embarrassing dancing.
Mean, Deku mumbles under his breath. Dynamite sneers in response. Think about it, Kotaro says. Is that fair to ask? Fine, Deku agrees after a moment. I'll think about sending it to you, but that's it. Dynamite shakes his head and turns back to the food, pulling the pork out of the pan and transferring it onto a paper towel-covered plate. He doesn't say anything else about the playlist, and Deku stays quiet again, allowing Dynamite to explain the steps of cooking the onions to almost caramelization, adding in the wet ingredients, and then
putting the pork back on top before adding the eggs. He takes another moment to explain different flavors that can be added to make unique versions of the standard dish and discusses at which point each flavor should be added for maximum effectiveness. The entire time he talks, gesturing with chopsticks, Deku watches him fondly, smiling a little to himself. He never interrupts, but he watches every movement Dynamite makes with rapt attention, completely enthralled by him. Once Dynamite has finished explaining the next steps, he sets off to perform them himself. He moves through the kitchen with absolute expertise, even though it's a fairly simple recipe to make. Every moment he makes with confidence, and it's clear that he's been doing this for a long time. He may have had some mistakes in the past, burnt rice and all that, but it doesn't appear as if he's made any mistakes in his cooking anymore. He stirs the onions in the pan before adding the other ingredients. He leaves them to cook while he pulls the rice off the heat, taking the lid off, disposing that in the kitchen sink as well. "Deku," he says. Immediately, Deku jumps into action. No additional words are spoken, no explanation of what he wants. He simply says Deku's name, but Deku seems to understand all the same. He stands up from his chair and crosses the kitchen, reaching into an overhead cupboard to pull down 3 bowls and carries them over to the kitchen counter, spreading them out. Dynamite follows behind him, dividing the rice evenly between each bowl, while Deku goes and grabs a pair of chopsticks for each bowl. He, too, moves around the kitchen with ease as if he'd been there a few times before, opening only one drawer because he knew where he needed to be, reaching inside with barely even looking. Once Dynamite had finished with the rice, he extends the pot to Deku, who takes it immediately, and they move around each other with practiced ease. Deku takes the pot to the sink while Dynamite heads back to the stove to take the last of the food off the heat, carrying it back to deposit in the bowls as well. The way they work around each other suggests years of working together out in the field, the kind of understanding that only comes from being close and doing a lot of training with each other. It was known that they often were sent on missions together because they worked well, but most civilians didn't get to see that teamwork because it was behind the scenes. "Now," Dynamite says, sliding a bowl across the counter with chopsticks sitting across the top of it. "This one's for Deku because he's a baby and he can't handle anything spicy." He slides the other bowl towards the camera. "This one's for you, Kotaro. They're chili flakes if you want them." And then he puts the last bowl towards himself, picking up the chili flakes as he does so. "And this one is for me. I will take chili flakes because I'm not a wimp and I like spice." Deku finishes putting the last pan in the sink and returns to the counter, dragging a second stool over and offering it to Dynamite, who slides onto it, propping one leg up as he does so. He takes up his own seat, reaching for the bowl and snapping his chopsticks with an empathetic, "Thank you, Kachan." "Kotaro," Deku says before he takes his first bite of food, the chopsticks halfway to his mouth. "Come on." Hesitantly, Kotaro wanders his way onto the screen, pausing in front of the bowl that has been offered up as his. "This is for me?" "Unless there's someone else here named Kotaro who has forced me to do a cooking show against my will," Dynamite says, already on his second bite of food. "You'll love it," Deku says, finally taking his first bite. "Kachan's katsudan is..." And then Deku's eyes go wide as he tries to hurry through chewing his bite of food, scrambling out of the chair as he rushes for a glass. "Spicy! Kachan, what did you do?" Immediately, Dynamite breaks out into laughter, throwing his head back and laughing so hard that he has to set his bowl down on the counter. Deku rushes around the kitchen behind him to try and fill a glass with water, drinking about half of it before pausing, panting, to glare at Dynamite from where he is a few feet away. "I put chili flakes in the eggs," Dynamite answers after his pleased laughter dies down. He swivels on his stool to look at Deku. "You deserved that, and you know it." "Now I know why you insisted that I do this show with you," Deku whines, taking another sip of water and fanning his mouth. "You just wanted to get back at me." "Yup," Dynamite agrees, reaching for his bowl of katsudon again and taking another bite. "And you make it so easy because you're such a goddamn baby about spices." He then turns to address the camera. Now, I don't recommend adding chili flakes to the eggs unless you really like spice or you have someone you need to get back at, like Deku. Normally, you should leave them for the end so you can add them in small doses until you get the spice level you desire. Kachan, that's so mean! Deku complains as he refills the glass with water and finally returns to his stool, pushing his bowl of food away. I was so excited to eat it! Oh, shut up! Dynamite says at the end of a frustrated sigh. I had Kotaro buy enough supplies that I can make you more. Immediately, Deku perks back up again. You did? But you're waiting until I finish eating mine first. Dynamite warns, pointing his chopsticks at Deku to make a point. Then he turns to regard Kotaro, who had taken a couple of bites of his own katsudon in silence. I'll remake yours too if you don't like the spice. Kotaro shakes his head, a hand covering his mouth as he swallows the bite he'd just taken. It's really good with spice, actually, he says. Thank you. It was very kind of you to make me a portion too. The last thing the episode shows is Dynamite looking at Kotaro, clearly surprised, cutting off right as he mumbles, Maybe you aren't so bad after all. Melancholy couch potato. I knew Dynamite and Deku were friends, but did anyone know they'd been friends since childhood? Apparently a robot. Did anyone else expect this to be a joke? Like clickbait or something? I didn't expect to actually find Dynamite and Deku cooking. Forgiving Summers. Not the apron. Komira. Is it just me, or does their fighting look more like flirting? Dynamite was pretty red in the middle there. Stevie Banks. And he can cook? Is there anything he can't do? 404 missing. Wait, what the fuck? Why is Dynamite actually a really good teacher? KT DK Lover. Not Deku being close with Dynamite's family. Crying emoji. Leo Wolf 35. Why doesn't this have more views? Why doesn't this have more views? Feral Ant Queen. I will actually fight Dynamite for title of number one Deku superfan. XXX Nerd XXX. This is it. This is my entire personality now. I'm only going to talk about this for the rest of my life. Cat 811. Petition to get Deku's cooking playlist. Fangirl on fire. I will do anything for that cooking playlist. X Paper Heart So. Who was going to tell me that Dynamite actually has a really pretty smile? Kotaro hadn't expected the first episode to have many views. They hadn't had long to advertise it, for one thing. Plus, the first episode of anything had the least number of views. That was how it worked. Word had to get out, the people who did see it had to talk about it. That was the nature of things. So when they posted it, and it got a couple thousand views, he was really happy. That was more than he could have asked for. He patted himself on the back for a job well done, and went to sleep content with himself. He'd gotten to learn more about both Deku and Dynamite, and he'd gotten to eat some delicious food that was more than he expected for the day, and he was going to sleep easy with that. So when he woke up Saturday morning to see hundreds of thousands of views, his jaw nearly hit the floor.
Alright, you guys, that was chapter 2 of Discriminating Taste. I hope you liked it, and I will be posting the next chapter sometime soon. If you did like it, please comment, like, subscribe, whatever you want. And if you like the fic so far, please go and give kudos to the original author or comment on their writing. I'm sure they would love it. Anyways, see you next time. Bye!